I took my float plane step, set it up for a little assembly bench or a workbench, layout bench, something kind of a bench. And I pulled the cylinders out of the boxes, got all the parts laying there, got the pistons lined up with the right numbers on the cylinders. The cylinders are stamped 1, 2, 3, and the pistons were marked with grease pencil 1, 2, 3. So I assume that means that those are kind of still matched. The wrist pins, piston pins, are marked 1, 2, 3. I didn't notice that, so I've got the pins laid out. And we got rocker arm shafts and then an assembly kit. Oh, those cylinders look a whole lot better than the one that I put on there. These cylinders look pretty good. They're cleaned up. There's no carbon in them. Well, those are all laid out. I told Jim that I had a couple of hold down nuts there, primarily the ones on the number 1 cylinder there. They take a real beating from the water and stuff getting in there. So he sent me a handful of new hold down nuts, both the 1/2 inch ones and the 7/16 inch ones, both of those. And he sent some bolts for the intake tubes. Those were pretty crusty, and some new exhaust nuts. Anyway, we're looking good here now. I'll get those cylinders figured out some more and maybe start putting those on. The cylinders are all on. They're not installed yet. I still got a lot to do for the installation. I'll hook up the drain lines and the intake and the exhaust and figure out which push rods go in there and all that kind of stuff. Set the valve lash, but they're mounted up. I washed everything all out real good with starting fluid and then put that Permatex Ultra Slick engine assembly lube on everything. Jim sent me up this little ring compressor here. That works pretty slick. You just do that by hand, stick it there on the piston and get it on the rings, and you can squeeze it by hand and slide that cylinder over there and slide it right down. The only problem, you have to have 3 hands to do it. You gotta have 2 hands to put the cylinder up there and 1 hand to hold this, but I got it done anyway with just 2 hands. I put the number 3 cylinder on, of these overhauled ones on first. Those are the ones that's the hardest to get into to get the nuts on and stuff. They're right over all of the castings on the case there, on that rear flange on the case and on the sump and everything else, so it's kind of hard to get in there to get those nuts on there on the back sides. With those number 2 and number 1 cylinders not on, it's pretty easy to get to those outside nuts on there on those studs. I started to torque down the number 3 cylinder, figuring I would torque them down as I went, but there's one stud there that runs through from the number 3 cylinder over to the number 2 cylinder, and it just started pulling it through. So I had to back off on that, and then I went over and put the number 2 cylinder on, and then I torqued the number 3 and the number 2 cylinder down at the same time. I don't know if it's as much of a problem on his Lycoming engines, but I was told that that was one of the big problems with the Continental engines, is you've got studs that run through all the way through the case and hold the cylinders down on opposite sides. And if you have a cylinder and change one, guys go on there and change that cylinder out and they'll torque it down, but they don't go over to the other side and torque down the bolts on the opposite side. And that puts uneven stress on the crankcase, and you wind up getting cracked crankcases. At least that's one of the theories. Sounds pretty good to me. One of the things I did was, when I had the covers off of those cylinders, I reached up in and moved the tappets. And because I had wiped those off checking for rust, I went ahead and sprayed them down with white lithium grease. This is stuff we used for assembly lube. And it could spray up in there. I tried getting in there with my fingers with some assembly lube, but I couldn't do an effective job on it. But I was able to spray in with this. I could spray it on the bottom of the lifter bodies, then reach in there and spin them around a quarter of a turn and spray some more in there. And I got them sprayed up pretty good. The inside of that crankcase is sprayed pretty good with this white lithium grease. And all the cam lobes are sprayed pretty good. So we'll see where we go from here. Probably maybe deflate all of those lifters. The next thing that I'm going to do on this, I don't know whether it's necessarily the next step or not, but it's the next step I'm going to do on this, is to set up these valves. And you have to set up the valve lash, or the gap between the valves and the rocker arms, by adjusting the length of the push rods. And the push rods are not adjustable, so you have to try one length of push rod, and if that doesn't work, then you go to a different length of push rod until you get the gap adjusted right. And the gap cold on these is between 28 thousandths and 80 thousandths. That's a pretty big gap. These lifters, of course, are hydraulic lifters. They're currently pumped up with oil. We have to deflate the lifter. Well, there's three parts to these lifters. There's a socket here that has a pocket in it that the push rod fits down into, and of course it's got a hole through it that pumps oil through it, and when it's working and everything's all pumped up, it actually pumps oil through the push rod into the rocker arm assembly to lubricate the valves and the rocker shaft. There we go. So this is the plunger assembly or pump. It's actually got a check valve in there, and this pumps up, and once it's got hydraulic pressure in it from the oil, then it's solid. And what we want to do there now is we'll take a piece of copper wire and push down through there to unseat that ball so that it can relieve the hydraulic pressure in that thing. And then once that's relieved, and we put everything back together and check the valve flash. So we put this in some solvent and clean it out. And then the other part of the valve of the lifter, the tappet body itself, won't come out because it's mushroomed. It's got a big head on it that rides the cam in there, and then there's a long body that's hollow that all this stuff flows in through. So that stays in, and we want to keep all these parts separate from each one of these individual ones because they're all kind of fitted together and they've worn in together. Well, here's the plunger and a piece of soft copper wire. Just push it in there and unseat that ball to try to relieve that hydraulic pressure out of there. Little trick to that, I guess, you got to make sure it's solvent in here so you don't get any. Make sure there's no dirt or anything in there. Trick is, I guess, to push in on this plunger and then go in and manipulate the valve. There, now it's squirting oil out of it. So that's clean. I'm going to stick that back in the same hole that it came out of, the same tappet that it came out of. And this socket, it goes back in there. I've got all of those lifters collapsed, and the next step is to set up a cylinder on top dead center. So I've set the number 1 cylinder up on top dead center, so the piston's at top dead center. Then they want you to put the push rod tubes in. I'm not going to put the push rod tubes in because they may be taking this off and on a few times before I get everything set right. And I want once I get my push rods adjusted right, my valve lash adjusted right, I'm going to want to pull those parts out of that lifter and lube them up with some assembly lube, make sure they're lubed up real good. So anyway, I've got the number 1 cylinder set up with a couple push rod tubes in it. And these push rod tubes are stamped with some numbers on them that tell you the various lengths of them, so you can go either plus or minus on them. These exhaust valves, they have a little cap that fits on them. The intake valves, the rocker arm just contacts the intake valve directly there, but on the exhaust valves there's a little cap that fits over them. So I lubed up that cap and stuck it on there. I want to make sure and get it in there seated tight. I've got rocker pins and I've got assembly lube here. I'm going to go ahead and lube everything up real good so these pins slide in and out of there good. I got the rocker arms in there and the pin in there, and you can see there's some movement in that. So the idea here now is to get feeler gauge, some kind of a gauge, and measure between the valve and the rocker arm. Get that down within a certain limit. I don't have any feeler gauge 80 thousandths or anything that big. The biggest I got I think is 30 thousandths or 32 thousandths or something like that. I've taken apart one of my feeler gauge sets and I've got 3 leafs out of it, a 23 thousandths, 27 thousandths, and a 29 thousandths. And that makes, well, that would make 79 thousandths. Anyway, that's close to 80 thousandths. And if I put that up there, that will not go in on this exhaust valve. That won't come anywhere close to going in on the exhaust valve. But the intake valve, I can slide it up in there. So the shaft on the intake valve, I'm going to have to take out and get a longer push rod tube to put in there. Well, there's different push rods, different lengths to adjust the valve lash on these. Took this push rod out to look at it, and it's a 15F19957-34. And I went in, and in the parts book, actually there's a Lycoming service bulletin. I forget what the number is, but I downloaded it, and I copied off this section here for these engines, the old 360 engines, and that one shows this one on there, 19957-34, and that shows it as 12.492 inches. We need a longer one for that to get the right valve lash on that. So the next one I'm looking for, then I'll look through all the parts I've got, all the push rods I've got, and a 3.5 then would be 23 thousandths longer than this one, which would bring it down within tolerance on there. So I'm going to go look for a 57-35. Put that in there and try it. Okay, so that one's a 3.5. Okay, so that one won't fit up in there now. That's the combination that makes the 80, actually it's 79. And here's the 28, and it fits up in there fine. I'll stick a 30 up in there, and that one still has lots of clearance. And there's 43, that still fits in there. That's a slip fit. Let me try, that'd be 45. That still fits in there. So that's getting it in the middle of the range there. That's getting close right there. So that one is pretty good, just the way it is. Well, now I can take this one apart and lube it up and put the shroud on it and everything and the seal on it, and that one's good to go. We'll move on to the next one and just keep working it like that. Got the push rod tubes picked out for the number 1 and number 3 cylinder, so I can take those apart. I have to be careful and make sure I get them back together in the right order, but I can put those push rod tubes on now. Both of them, the exhaust valves took the 34, and both of them, the intake valves, took a 35. Number 3 cylinder is all together. The valve portion of it is all back together now. Pulled the lifter parts out, the tappet parts out that I could get, cleaned them up, dried them out, and put some lube on them. Put the push rod tubes in, put the push rods in, got the actually I should have done that first. There's a keeper here for the push rod tubes to hold those in, and I forgot to put it in until after it, so I had to jockey around and jimmy it around to get it in there without pulling that push rod tube again, or the rocker arm shaft. So we squirted some lube on the valve stems there, on the valve springs, and lubed up the rocker arms good, and slid the shafts in. Now I've been working with these shafts just plain. They're new shafts that they sent me. I got new bushings in there. I've just been working with those planes, but they got little plastic cap here that go in the end of them when you get them all together. I guess that probably keeps them from rubbing holes in the rocker box cover if they slide out. But those are all in. They're equal on both sides. They're all pre-lubed up and everything. I slid this shaft out this way, the rocker shaft out this way, pulled this first rocker arm out, did this one, and then put it all together, slid the shaft out this way, pulled this one apart and did it. That way I'm not mixing up any of the parts or pieces. Just slide the shaft one way and then slide it the other way, and everything goes, you just take apart one of these at a time, and that way everything goes back in exactly the way we've got it tested out and lined up to go. I'll go ahead and do the number 1, and then I've got to go over to the other side and do all of the fit up for the number 2 and number 4. We got number 2 and number 4 cylinders on there, all mounted up, valves all adjusted. Everything went pretty good, except for number 4 I had a little bit of trouble with. I used a 34 here on the intake, and on the exhaust I went through a 35, and I didn't have enough clearance on it, so I went through 3 of them, and I finally got it to where I got about 45 thousandths of clearance on there. So that worked out okay. Even though they were the same number, they still wound up giving me different clearance on that valve. So those are all buttoned up now. I've got them all locked in and everything. That finishes out that end of it anyway. So I'll put the rocker box covers on there. And the valve train is all set up on those cylinders. Got the valve lash all adjusted on them, and everything's all buttoned down inside. One of the other things that I need to do is there's a couple of things on these cylinders here, the old ones, that I need to transfer over onto the new one. Now these two here are the number 1 and number 3 cylinder. They have a nipple here for the primer to go into. That injects fuel right into the intake valve, intake port there. I have to take these nipples out and put those in the new cylinders. And right down here below this spark plug hole is a port into the head for the cylinder head temperature gauge. Now originally we had a cylinder head temperature gauge that just has a ring on it that fits in place of a spark plug gasket, but those kept getting tore up. The leads kept getting banged up on them because you have to take them on and off every time you clean the spark plugs. They're constantly getting moved around and banged around. So I went ahead and got the adapter there for the probe. I have to get the adapter off the number 4 cylinder that we took off and put it on the number 4 cylinder on this one. And we'd put it on the number 4 cylinder because that's the one that runs the hottest. Anyway, that's what's next here. I'll get those little ports fixed up there for the primer line and the cylinder head temperature gauge probe.